Okay, I want to talk about criticism. And I don't mean like criticism like when someone says, you're an idiot and should die. That's not criticism, that's just ad hominem and insults. Criticism is when somebody like me takes a work of art or a video game or a movie or TV show, a book, and does a careful reading of it or a careful viewing of it, and then tries to pick it apart to find out what works and what doesn't. I mean, critics are basically like it's not quality control. It's not like a mechanic. We do this so that we can help people think more deeply about something, and so that the people who create works of art or write books or film movies or whatever else can understand what a critical eye is seeing. You know, not just a fan, not just uh, a numb audience, but an active participant in experiencing their work. And some people hate critics because some critics can be real jerks, you know. And you hear it a lot from certain authors or from certain directors, you know. Oh, we're not doing this for the critics, we're doing this for the fans. Well, a lot of times a critic is also a fan. I read about Game of Thrones. I am a big fan of Game of Thrones. I can honestly say that probably, other than maybe Tolkien, no work of fantasy fiction has influenced me or affected me as greatly as George R. R. Martin's work. And yet I am still also a critic of his work and of the TV show. So I just wanted to address some of the things that I hear as a critic all the time. One thing I hear is, why don't you go make your own big budget TV show if you think you could do it so much better? Now, this is a preposterous thing to say to a critic. We are not. We are not making this stuff. We're criticizing it. That is our job. And we don't have to be able to go, I don't have the money to go make a big budget fantasy drama like Game of Thrones. Most people don't. It's a huge process that requires dozens, if not hundreds, of people to even just start making a show like that. It's not within my realm, the realm of possibility, and it's also an absurd attack on critics because that's not what we're doing. We're not making shows. We are critiquing them. And just because somebody's good at making a show doesn't mean they would be good at critiquing a show. So just because someone can write a book doesn't mean they're going to be a good critic of other books. Some people are. I mean, there are novelists like John Updike who are also terrific critics, but it doesn't always work that way. Similarly, like an actor might be a really good actor, but they may not be great at writing about other people's acting, you know? So this is an absurd sort of attack on criticism. That's not the function that we are here to provide. We are here to simply help other people have a more interesting and deep conversation about something like Game of Thrones. We're not here to make our own competing show to prove that we can do that. That's just not our role. Another thing that I hear, especially when I'm writing a video game or a TV show like The Walking Dead or Game of Thrones, I think it's somewhat specific to this to genre writing. Is, well, this is a show about dragons, and this is a show about zombies, or, you know, this is just a video game. Why do you care? Why do you care? Why are you worrying about these things like the fast travel in Game of Thrones? Why are you worrying about that when there's dragons? Okay, this is another terrible thing to say to a critic, because internal consistency, internal logic, and plausibility within the framework of a fiction is extremely important. So, for instance, within Game of Thrones fantasy framework, yes, dragons are a thing, magic is a thing, but that doesn't mean that characters can just act however they want. You know, in The Walking Dead, one of my biggest criticisms of characters just act however the writers want them to act, and even if it breaks their character, just so that they can move the plot along. And to say, you know, well, this is a zombie show, is not a good argument to make. The reason that something like Game of Thrones or The Walking Dead was initially popular was because these are fantasies that truck in realism and in plausibility. You know, you don't have characters like Rick Grimes suddenly just shooting fireballs out of their fingertips. You know, there are internal logic and consistency at play in these works of fiction. In Game of Thrones, like, you know, there's not, you don't have, you know, Raceland or like the magic from something like Dragonlance suddenly coming in. You know, you don't have hundreds of dragons. You have consistent rules. One of the rules in Game of Thrones has always been that things play out like our own world. There are real people with complicated motivations, and that's what makes these things popular in the first place. Is that they are realistic to some degree and that they have an internal logic. If they didn't, these would not be popular works of art to begin with. If Game of Thrones was written in such a way that the plotting didn't make sense, it probably never would have been optioned for TV in the first place. So it's important to look at these things and to criticize shows and the writing in shows or games or whatever else when it starts to break its own rules, because rules hold it all together. It's the thread that keeps the blanket together, you know. And it doesn't matter that it's about dragons or zombies or anything else. This is irrelevant. This would apply just as easily to a show about, you know, rich British people in the British countryside, you know, like Downton Abbey or something. You know, if suddenly characters start acting out of character, if the writing ditches plausibility, this makes for a bad story, and it doesn't matter if it's a genre story or superhero story or whatever. Go back to the show Heroes. I don't know if you guys saw that. The first season was really good. It had, you know, its own sort of rules for heroes and villains, and it had an interesting backstory that we wanted to learn more about. But by season 2, they started breaking their rules. They started bending like their own systems of superpowers, and they started cheating, and it really the writing just went so far downhill largely because of this. And you know, to say, well, you can't say these things because it's a superhero show is absolutely ludicrous. And if, you know, if the writers on that show and the producers on that show had maybe paid a little more heed to criticism, maybe it would, you know, would have been, you know, gone down as one of the great superhero shows of our time. Of course, there's also ad hominem, which I mentioned earlier. Attacking the critic is very common. A lot of fanboys of things get really angry when you say things about their show. This happened a lot with Arrow when I talked about Elicity and how it was killing the show, even though I was right. Objectively right. The ratings were going down, and there was a reason for it. There were lots of reasons for it. But anyways, you know, I am routinely told that I should not have a job, that I should be fired, that, you know, in my opinion, it's wrong, that and probably the biggest one that I hear is that I'm biased. This is a really interesting form of ad hominem because it's sort of a ludicrous thing to say to a critic. We saw this a lot with kind of around Gamergate when a lot of people were saying they wanted objective reviews, and it is one of the great ironies, I think, that I've heard, that objective, I mean, you want a certain level of objectivity when you go into reviewing a game or a TV show. You want to be able to understand, you know, things like cinematography, you know, things like textures, and, you know, all these sort of, you know, inputs in a video game. How are they input? There's objective things about it to some degree. You know, there's that technical side, and that's fine. But there's a whole lot of stuff that is so subjective, and it just depends on what you've read, what you've experienced in life. You know, our opinions are going to differ, and it's so funny to me when people say you're biased. You know, well, yeah. I mean, it's not like I'm biased against someone. Like, here's where bias would actually be an issue in a review. It would be when, let's say, I knew the game developer, or I know the director of that episode of the TV show, or I really hate a certain actor or something, and then that sort of personal bias seeps into my reviews. But that's a whole different story to just, you know, I have this opinion. that's my own subjective opinion. So this is three things you should never say to critics, right? You should never say, why don't you go make your own multi-million-dollar movie or TV show or game? Obviously, that is not the function of a critic and would be very difficult to do. Even if someday, you know, I'd love to work on a script or something like that, that still would be totally separate from my role as a critic. Number two, it's just a movie. It's just a TV show about zombies. You know, this is completely ridiculous to say. A story is a story, no matter what genre, no matter what it has going on for it in terms of magic. There has to be some kind of rules involved, some kind of logical consistency and character consistency involved. And finally, you're biased, you're not objective, whatever. Obviously, critics have to have opinions, or there would be no critics. There would be no point in reading criticism. We hopefully just have well thought out opinions that can spark debate and conversation. And finally, I just want to say, you know, it's okay not to agree with a critic. It's okay to say, I disagree with you, and here's why. It's perfectly valid to offer up your own set of reasoning, your own arguments, to provide evidence, etc. We don't mind. I don't mind when people say, you know, I see where you're coming from, but I disagree. I think it's great because having a conversation always helps stir the brain cells and bring out the best kind of ideas and thoughts. Conversation is the lifeblood of criticism, really. I know we work alone as we type our reviews up, but it always helps if I have someone to talk about it with before or after I write. And of course, opinions change and evolve. You know, sometimes I've written a critique of something and I come back to it later and I have a different feeling about it now that I'm older. You know, it's the same with music. You know, I like things I didn't like when I was 20. I like things I didn't like when I was 10. I like things I didn't like when I was 35. And I'm 36. So criticism is always evolving. Anyways, I just wanted to get some of this stuff off my chest to make a video about it so that when people say these things to me, I can be like, here, go watch this. And hopefully they get something out of it. I don't want people just to feel like idiots. But sometimes I feel annoyed enough to call them idiots. Anyways, thank you for watching. Peace.
Holidays inbound. We need that ship off the field.
Someone told me you need a ride.